everyone. I am not your host tonight. Your host will be Paul. But today is a special evening, not just because it's the last of season 3, but it's the last for Paul as an active member of Psychosocial Wednesday. He decided to retire and to enjoy his free time. So this trio, the Three Musketeers, will become another trio with the support of Ludmila Osterman, so also female voice that is very nice. But I, with Berna, would like to take this opportunity to really thank you, Paul. We did something big. We did something beautiful. We were not aware of this when we started, when actually you contacted me in March 2020 because Berna contacted you. It was not easy. Sometimes it was really difficult, but I think it was really beautiful. Thank you for everything you did, for everything we did together. And I don't know if you, Berna, want to add anything.
Yeah, short remark. Yeah, it all started with your first Zoom session in March, I think, Paul, you might remember. This brought everything in line then. And it was really a pleasure to working with you, I must say.
Thank you. That's lovely. That's lovely. I was thinking, I was also going to say, I'm leaving only because I actually, this is my third life and my second career. So I retired from the university in February and suddenly realized I was on the Jung Institute Alumni Association and their research council and this other thing and this other thing and this other thing. And I suddenly thought, why am I doing meetings? So I'm going to be a real retired person where I have analysands whom I enjoy and writing, which I must do, and occasional teaching. So that's all I'm going to do, but I'm definitely around. And one more thing I wanted to say with Psychosocial, it's been fantastic. Right? We've been really lucky. Some glitches here and there, but we've survived. And some of what's made it wonderful has been these graphics by Nico Chernchevich, and also from the second year, some music by one of my former students, Connor O'Boyle. So there's beautiful, it's the artwork attached to what we're doing that I think has also been not obviously as important as the brilliant speakers, but really nice, I must say. So I think we're very, very grateful for that. I think then at the end, if Stefano will let me, at the end of today's talk, I'll tell you the list of people in 2023, which have already been arranged, which is pretty fantastic. So that's all prelude. I'm really delighted to be introducing Stephani Stephens. I invited her because I was so excited by her book, C.G. Jung and the Dead, Visions, Active Imagination, and the Unconscious Terrain, which what's particularly marvelous about it is the intelligent, clear handling of dense material that doesn't fit easily into different epistemological systems. And to calmly do that without either being skittish or essentially overblowing things, right? It's beautifully done, I think. I find it really delightful. Stephani is a psychotherapist and lecturer in counselling at the University of Canberra in Australia. We're also absolutely honored that she's willing to do this at what is for her 7 a.m. It is difficult to work with people from the other side of the Pacific, so thank you very much. Stephani today is talking about the dynamics of ancestral inheritance. So I will let her go ahead and give her presentation. Thank you, Stephani.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's a wonderful, wonderful introduction. I'm very humbled by it. And it's just lovely to see old friends in the room here and new friends. So really, thank you for coming. I know we're all rushing to the exit to get to the holidays and close our books in our rooms and our markings. So I really appreciate you coming, everybody. As you can see, the sun is coming up over the neighbor's house here, and I might have to shimmy a bit. So forgive that, so that we'll find our orientation. I want to also thank the Psychosocial Wednesday group. I was so utterly delighted when you started this, because for a lot of us, well, for the world, really, we retracted, we went into our reading and thinking, we kept our clients going. And this was such a delightful outlet. And as I explained to my colleagues at the university, the Jungians got chatty, and it was just so fun to attend those talks. Before we get started, I'd like to do something that we do in Australia, which is I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm presenting this talk and where I live and work, the Ngunnawal people. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And this is a particularly apt topic and an apt gesture considering what we're talking about this evening. What I'm going to talk about today is something that is in true synchronicity, going to be published in a collection that's coming out at the end of this month called The Spectre and the Other in Jungian Psychoanalysis. And this is a collection that's put together by Mary Beth Carter and Stephen Farrar, based on our IAJS conference in Cape Town a few years ago. I think they've done a great job. I know that's a real plug for the book, but I think it was a really amazing gathering, and some really wonderful papers resulted from it. So part of what I'm going to discuss today is based on that research that I did then and building a bit since then. You know, when we talk about the dynamic of ancestral inheritance, what we're looking at is basically a pattern. And the pattern lends itself it's partly defined on how the past arrives in the present, how it occupies the present, and how it demands an adjustment in order to step into the future. Okay, I'm going to shimmy a little bit here, so hopefully that works. And so as I was thinking about how to present in such a short amount of time, I thought what we might do is look at material that's already out there in terms of books and films, movies, TV shows. And obviously that's because, you know, creative products, creative media is really, you know, the font and seasoned with unconscious perspectives. And I think this kind of orientation, and it might be a little unorthodox, helps me show you the pattern that I'm looking at, when we talk about this kind of dynamic. So just as we all know the dream that Jung had of the wicked gentleman from the previous century who were posing him this question in Latin, and he wasn't able to grasp the question in the dream. He wasn't able to understand what they were saying, even though he said, I know the language, I knew my Latin. And he emerges from this dream very unsettled, of course, and then he thinks, right, I'm going to leave what I'm doing and I'm going to re-engage with my research and writing, which was the psychology of the unconscious. And that gesture, that putting into action was a real pattern in terms of being incited by an ancestral nudging, if you will, and putting into action so that he could be at peace with that moment, and also so the wicked gentleman could be answered in some way to their question. So what I'm going to do is discuss a few examples, and those of you who know my work, if you could bear with me while I go through the Aeneid yet again. But I think the Aeneid and this particular dynamic is very well suited to our purposes this morning. So basically, many of us know the Aeneid, written by Virgil, written in Latin, is about a hero. It is about a struggling hero. And it's about Aeneas who leaves Troy. He leaves with his father and his son, which is very symbolic. He leaves with the generations, okay? And he leaves with the survivors of a burning city and a falling age. And he gets on boats and he has all these adventures. But at one point, he's really very despondent, and he doesn't have any energy or vision to continue on with his life and the onerous burden of carrying a people and what is meant to be for his people, the leader of his people. So he in this very low point, he sees the ghost of his father, Anchises. And what Anchises says to him in this ghostly form is, please come to the underworld. I want to show you something. And so he prepares, he meets with the Sibyl, and of course the Sibyl has been compared to the anima, and he meets with the Sibyl who's going to guide him into the work that he needs to do in the unconscious, in the underworld, in the land of the dead. And what they do is he eventually, in terms of meeting his past and present through the underworld, he finds Anchises. And Anchises says to him, do you see this lineage, this amazing lineage of famous, renowned, important people that are going to build this new land because of you? And so you need to get back in that boot. You need to take up the mantle of your destiny in order so that this lineage can happen. And you are fundamentally a part of this lineage. And so this is what he does. And of course, the rest of the book is his adventures towards that. But the dynamic at play here that's so interesting for me is that when he does this, when he acts upon the request of Anchises' ghostly form, he not only heals himself, but he heals Anchises. And so Anchises can move from being a ghost to stepping in as an ancestor and stepping into the very lineage that he has shown Aeneas that's so important. So in fact, this moment that Aeneas answers is healing for them both, okay? All right, so that's my ancient example because I think it sets up the dynamic really well. The next example, I'm going to talk about a film, an Australian film from a few years ago called Lion, and maybe some of you know this film. It's the story about a boy, Saru, who at 4 years old, he lives in India. At 4 years old, he leaves with his teenage brother, Gadu, and they go in towards the train station. They leave their village, they go towards the train station, and Saru, being quite young, is hungry and tired, and Gadu says, okay, I'm going to go look for food, and I'm going to go look for a job quickly, and I will come back and I will pick you up and take you home. And so what happens is Gadu leaves him on the train platform. This little boy falls asleep, and when he wakes up, he's disoriented, and he hops on a train, and the train takes him thousands of miles away from that platform, from his family. And a bulk of this movie is really about his adventures, but also his story of becoming an adoptee in Australia. And when he becomes a university student, there is this scene where he is at a party with other Indians, and he smells a pastry that he had not thought of, and it brings back the trauma of becoming an adoptee and all of those years. As soon as this happens, he begins this deep exploration of his origin story, coming to Australia, and what happened to his family of origin. And as a result, he starts hearing his biological mother and Gadu calling him. And this becomes very unsettling. And his adult life, he starts to unspool. It's very unnerving. And so he can't let go. He's in this complex. He can't let go. And so he starts to consider with the help of Google Earth, which is part of the plug of this film, I guess, he starts to really explore what exactly happened that day, where he thinks he went north-south, and he gets the map of India, and he really starts to explore, still while hearing the voices of his mother and his brother. He does find, through much searching, he does find the village where he was born and where his family lives. And he goes back, and part of the wonderful, cheerful part of this film is this connection that he rekindles with his biological family. When he arrives to connect with his mother, he asks, and he's very surprised that Gadu isn't there. And she said, but Gadu disappeared the same night you did. And we learn later that he was killed sometime around that time. And so you're left with this mystery about how this teenager died, how he disappeared on the same night. And what ends up becoming quite important is that Gadu, in one sense, has completed his promise to take Saru back home by his calling and his luring, in calling out to him and inciting him on this journey of exploration. Not only is this deeply healing for Saru to be connected to his family of origin, but it's a healing for Gadu as well. And so here's an example of Gadu moving from a haunting presence to part of Saru's lineage and ancestry. Okay. So the next example I'd like to give you is from a TV show. And I don't know about you, but I got really familiar with Netflix over the pandemic. And there was a particular TV show that I quite liked called Sense8, and maybe some of you have seen it. Now, I think Sense8 is endlessly fascinating for Jungians. There is just so much material here that you could plant a flag anywhere in the series and work out from there. And I think that Jungians particularly would find it incredibly symbolic on so many levels and interesting. There's layers to the plot, and I'm going to try and simplify for the model and for what we're trying to do here. There are 8 people that live in different countries on the planet, and they are only connected by 2 conditions. One, they've all been born the same day, the same hour and minute. And the second is they all have had visions of a suicide of a woman named Angelica. And not only are they having visions, they have seen this suicide, and now they are having visions of her in their daily life, and they don't understand it. What kind of builds on this is that they share not only these circumstances, but they begin to share a sensory matrix or an overlay so that they can feel each other's thoughts, they can see each other in flashes. They don't understand it, but it's unfolding. And what they grow to learn is that they each have specific talents and strengths that they're able to share and become supportive of one another in need. But the protagonist, or one of these protagonists in particular, who begins the story, is named Will. And Will is a Chicago policeman. And his father was a detective. And when he was 10, he began having visions of a little girl named Sarah. And Sarah was kidnapped and disappeared and was never found. And one of Will's issues when he was young and during this time that it happened was that he could see Sarah. And what he begins to wonder as an adult is if he could have prevented her eventual death. Now, this haunts him alongside his new ability to be able to be flooded with information, not only from these 7 other people, but from his own memories. This memory of Sarah and her kidnapping and her torture are very close to the surface. And this begins to niggle at him. So not only is this memory actually calling him back to the historical moment of this unsolved murder, but it also augurs this quickening of his ability to kind of tune in to these other people. Now, of course, what we find in the course of the story is that, and as it unfolds, is that the criminal of Sarah's murder has actually reappeared and becomes a main player. Milton becomes a main player as the bad guy in pulling these people together and wanting things from them. But basically, a very complex series, but basically what ends up happening is that Will comes to a place where he is at peace with Sarah's murder, and he's in a sense solved this murder that's been lingering for so many years. He's not only solved it for his father, who was not able to do so, but he's also answering a question that's been posed to him by Sarah and by his present circumstances. So at that moment, we are to understand that Sarah can kind of shift to the background and become part of his history without becoming a part of the past haunting in his present. Okay, so from these particular examples, there's a pattern. Okay, and you can see that pattern where the past that's unresolved arrives in the present to be tended by some action, by some acceptance, and adding some space. A few years ago, I read as another example, I was reading an interview with quite a well-known actress, and this actress was talking about her family history, and she was mentioning how her grandmother was in one of the concentration camps. And as a result, she never remembers a time that her mother left the house without food in her bag, and was always offering her food when they were out shopping or doing tasks. And she mentions that she too, when she leaves the house, is very mindful about bringing food and about keeping it. And she wonders with her daughter if in fact she's passing on food scarcity issues, and she herself worries about food allergies. And what I love about that example is that it's offered in terms of the question and the resolution, because the actress not only poses this "I wonder if," but she leaves this idea open of transgenerational inheritance. And because she is both asking the question and answering, there's a sense of healing to be able to hold both of those in her mind. And in terms of therapeutically, it also allows her to be mindful of what that present conversation about food allergies is doing to the dynamic, and how much is based on her child and how much is inherited. Okay, and so I actually love that example. I'm just going to share with you briefly an experience with one of my own clients, and it kind of fits the pattern, but there are some elements to it that are slightly different. I had a client who was 18, 19 years old. She was suffering depression and severe anxiety. She was in a transition from secondary school to quite a rigorous tertiary program, quite a well-known program, so that there was quite a bit of celebration around her being accepted to this program, and an artist as well. And we worked for several months on the anxiety and depression. And she told me a story of something that occurred where during one of her most lowest moments, one of her strategies was to reach for her sketch pad, and she couldn't find it. So she opened the closet and was moving things around, and she found the second missing earring It was a butterfly. And as she's telling this story, her whole affect changed. And it was as if, she opened the closet and was one person and emerged out of the closet a totally other person. She said this moment of finding the earring meant so much to her. And it took us on this therapeutic moment where it reconnected her to her faith and how she was relating to her faith, the faith that she was raised in. And as she kept revisiting this story, she connected the earring to her grandmother, who was not only deceased, but the last time she saw her was in her country of origin before she emigrated. And at one point, when she last shared the story, she said, I actually think that earring was from my grandmother. I think she left it there for me to find, and to find at that particular moment because I really needed it. And so we are unsure of what the grandmother's circumstances are in this particular instance, but the fact that she came to this acknowledgement, I feel, created the space in the therapy, a broadening and holding that allowed her to expand that notion. And that allowed her also to consciously put her grandmother as an ancestor and not a niggling presence or not a niggling question, if you will. So, I think when we talk about this, I think we can see this kind of pattern that Jung himself really tripped on and tripped over all through the Red Book. He emerges from that material with serious questions, not only about what the dead are and who the dead are and where the dead are, but what our duty to the dead is. And he took on that question with real commitment. And we know this because he says that, when I go to the tower, when I kind of sit in my quiet space, I'm at peace. That's where the ancestors are also at peace, because I've answered the questions that they've asked of me. And therefore, I've not only recouped that anxious energy, the anxious arrival, but I've put them in a line where they can be a part of my lineage and my inheritance, and they can become ancestors and not ghostly presences, right? And so I just want to read you, I'll just read you another quote. I think when he talks about the unanswered, unresolved, and unredeemed, he's really talking about those questions like the bewigged gentleman. He's talking about questions that are offered. And he warns us, in the Red Book, like, you can ignore this if you want. Like, you can pretend that immortality isn't a thing, but if you do, this is going to cause issues for you. So in a sense, in the Nox Secunda commentary, this is where he kind of works some of this out, where he's saying, I really think, for me anyway, I need to tend to my dead. I need to consciously answer those questions. And I need to consciously figure out what the questions are, because sometimes those questions aren't really clear. I think Shamdasani too has raised an interesting question, which is who were Jung's ancestors? And that's a really wide open question. Is Plato one of his ancestors? Is Kant? Would he consider Freud to be a part of that lineage, professional or personal? Obviously his parents, and this really interesting bifurcation of his, the religious branch of the family and the uncanny branch of the family. And so I think that question is a very good one. And I think one that researchers, scholars are still kind of trying on, putting a lens to, trying to figure it out. So he says in MDR, inner peace and contentment depend in large measure upon whether or not the historical family, which is inherent in the individual, can be harmonized with the ephemeral conditions of the present. And so what we're talking about in this dynamic is a recalibration that allows for a mindful connection to one's history and one's past, no matter how far it goes back, this mindful connection so that the present can be readied and can be prepared to travel into the future in order, in terms of Aeneid, to accept one's destiny without being labored with baggage, ancestral baggage, okay? And I think just one last thing that was really very good when we talk about who are the ancestors. Adrienne Harris, who's a Sabina Spielrein scholar, talked about, in one of her excellent articles, talked about as she was pursuing the scholarship and resurrecting some of this rich scholarship that Sabina had written, she said that the process was like for her turning this ghost that has been on the periphery of the history of psychoanalysis. You know, where is Sabina? Where is her work? Where has it disappeared? Turning her from a ghostly presence into an ancestor. And that for her, resurrecting that scholarship was really about that connection. So I think, I mean, this is like a quick, fast and loose kind of moment to pull all this together and offer it and kind of drop it. But I really think we could open it up for thoughts and comments, concerns, questions. I'm happy to hear from you now.
Thank you, Stephanie. Lovely. I'm tending to, if I can just sort of point out context, which seems so important in this. If we're considering ancestral inheritance, it would be thinking rather differently than ancestral trauma. That can be included in there, but it's not merely treating the past as a source of damage. So that would be also like the difference between Freud's and Jung's handling of the past. It's like, where do we go with this? What can we do with it? And there's also, I'm remembering something that was when I was doing my university teaching in the early 2000s, I would often end an extended series of lectures on contemporary music with music in the early 2000s that seemed so international in such a beautiful way. So it was this battle between, is globalization good or bad? And that sense that if we have our individual connections to, this might link with some of our identity politics. If we have our individual connections to our past, but also our respect for different identities of ancestors, as well as each other, it wouldn't have to turn into a wasteland of everything the same. It would be quite different, right? And it could be full of life. So that would be that answer to, I suppose the old question then was, wouldn't we ideally want to return to some sort of village context where we could support each other as in a traditional village? But that's out of reach. But can a modern city have that kind of support? You can see where I'm going. It's perhaps simplistic, but does that fit with what you're saying? Or
I love those connections that you're talking about, and they're so big. Those are big connections. In terms of the music, I mean, you can see this in action, actually, often. I was listening to Kendrick Lamar talk about his newest album. I have like a thing for hip hop music and rap. And he talks about how his newest album is this homage to Tupac Shakur. Yeah. And, you know, Tupac was kind of this now a legendary, iconic figure. Yes. And so I think, you know, art and work that's considered artistic I think artists are particularly good at holding the space of inheritance and being able to acknowledge that lineage. I see that in music. I see that in painting. I see that in other spaces. I mean, just consider the act of an actor. That gesture of acting is an inherited conception that comes from the writer, the artist, the playwright. And so stepping into the ideal and idea of someone else's conception is inheritance, right? So in terms of, can you expand on what you mean by cities and city building? That's very interesting.
Well, I guess I am thinking at a big level. You'll pardon me, I can be horribly unintuitive.
No, I like it. I like what you're doing. I just want to understand it more, what you're saying about the city building.
Sometimes when we think of we, what do I mean by we? This is a question that's come up in some of the LGBTQ groups. We know that in, say, an old-fashioned village setting, we may have had no place, or we may have had a specific place as some sort of shaman kind of thing. So if so many people in cities these days are a bit lost, a bit disoriented, think of everyone's response to COVID. This isn't merely illness, I'm permanently frightened, I'm disoriented. Some of that is the problem of the city versus the village, right?
Okay.
So we can't really go back to villages, but if we are aware of our own backgrounds, our own ancestors, and we treat sort of ancestors more widely, as you did at the beginning, the whole problem of being white in Australia, and of going, we have to respect the ancestors that were here that are not our ancestors, but we can respect them. Then all of a sudden it can be a lot more grounded. It doesn't have to be, disconnected. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. That really does make a lot of sense. And if any of you are following metaverse as a space, I think it's for health professionals, mental health professionals, I think it's a really important space to follow, because people are emerging in metaverse and saying, I'm coming with this wound of not fitting in and post-COVID. And yet look at this accessible community of support I'm finding in this virtual space. And so, when you talk about the village could be the answer, I think that generations that are coming up are actually creating the village that they need through identity, through fluidity, through not being tied down. I mean, just look what we're doing here. How many countries? I mean, this is our village, right? On many levels.
So
and
it's a created village, kind of.
Sorry?
Almost a created village or a meta village.
Yes, absolutely. And yet, what have we been talking about but our inherited connection and an inherited academic inheritance, if you will. And that guides us to also create new avenues for the future. All of us are doing that. And so I think I wouldn't say that the village is dead by any means, but I do think in some weird, wacky way that COVID has actually caused a quickening, by all of us retracting. The reaction has been this quickening of prioritizing, of deciding who is my kin. Where is my kin? For people who were stuck in other places, suddenly there was this realignment for them. And who are our household gods and where do we take them, and what gods are no longer useful in our homes, right? And so I think I don't think, here's a great quote, that people, and I'm paraphrasing, people don't know how to live in places other that are haunted. People need to live in haunted places, right? Wow. Because we almost don't know how to live without this inherent connection to the past, right? And I guess if I were just going to extend this slightly, and we don't need to go off in this tangent, but right now my work, I'm working on a piece now about our responsibility to not only understand the psychology, but the psyche before we journey on long haul space travel. Now, astronauts are doing that now, but if we're talking about populating a planet that's never, as far as we know, has had any human connection, then we need to be pretty clear about what we're taking there, right?
Yes.
And I don't want to just talk about projection, but
Sure.
we need to be mindful. And I can't think of a better time and place to really make sure that we know ourselves, to know ourselves deeply, and to know the inherited connection that we might be bringing to this new space. So I know that we don't need to go there.
No, that makes perfect sense. No, that's absolutely wonderful. And I do think this is sort of a tangent to this, but I know that many of my former students and younger analysans have also been, last year particularly, they were quitting jobs that they didn't like, which I think lines up for this. What they're saying is, you know, the structure of my job and what I have to do for it, if it's crap, I don't want to do it anymore, right? So I would choose my ancestors, choose my family instead. And they're insisting on that more. That's very clear.
And the evolution, there's some interesting research on kinship growth, you know, and we saw that in the pandemic, where you saw people who were uncoupled renting spaces to pandemic together, right? And this idea of forming kinship groups based on whatever it's based on, right?
Logical.
Based on creating this community that serves them for the moment. And, you know, this seems from what I've read in this limited sense, and I think there's more research coming out, these were very successful endeavors. The idea of kinship building is quite important in Australia, where you have groups of people who are related based on culture, right? And so we're very, when we train counselors and we're training therapists, we really spend a lot of time talking about kinship gatherings and how people form families, how do people live in alignment to the love that they're expressing. So we do spend a lot of time on that.
Fantastic. Here's another big question. This is from Punita Miranda. I'm interested in hearing how could we recognize the patterns we perceive in our daily life and connect with them as ancestors, or connect them to an ancestor, I think she may also mean, which does extend, I suppose what you and I were just talking about sounds like we're talking about the living, but then if we're also going to take it to the ancestors, maybe that's part of what she's asking.
Yes, I mean, I think there are lots of techniques. I mean, Natalie Rogers talks about listen for the secrets that aren't expressed. Listen to the words that you don't want to say, or listen to the words that you're saying in a repetitive way. Who's showing up? I mean, Abramson and Torek do a great job with this. You know, they say, and this is interesting work if you want to dive into it further. You know, when someone comes from therapy and they say, I need help, I'm paraphrasing, who's the I, right? And if we as therapists can step back and hold that question while someone's exploring that, that can be a window and a door to a couple different directions of ancestry, right? And so I think, Punita, there's several ways of doing it. You know, what archetypes are knocking on your psyche's door? You know, what's nagging at you? What is showing up for you? What kind of repetitive thoughts are you having that need tending? And of course, these can be just typical nagging of daily life. But at the same time, they can be connected to, as Paul, you mentioned, traumatic pasts. Okay. And I think that, trauma is very difficult work and a difficult space to be in. And yet, I'm sure we've seen some amazing gifts of perception that come with it. And so, who are the archetypes showing up for you? What kind of anxieties are you suffering? I mean, I know that in my life, when I am feeling particularly anxious, if I just stop, then it's, it's psychic pressure. They're messages that are trying to come to me. So I've conditioned myself, I've practiced in that process for me, because it works for me that way, where I can stop and go, oh, that's what this is about. Okay, well, maybe this pattern of anxiety does come from a few generations back, and that makes sense. So do I need to worry about it? No, I'll just hold it until it processes and realigns. Does that kind of get at it, Anita?
Yeah, but would you because I also work in the consulting room, would you personally do it quietly for yourself? But because so many clients wouldn't go that far, if you talk about ghosts or ancestors, they might feel a bit, you just hold the possibility, that the field, the space for them.
Right. And listen, I think there are clients who feel comfortable and will say, I think it's a ghost, or I think it's this. And there are clients who are edging up to that, and you can feel that, right? And so I hold the space with possibility. And sometimes I'm like, oh, dude, it's your grandmother. But I know that, but that's not for me. It's not about me, right? It's about the client. And so, and it doesn't really matter if the client goes there or not. I think the resolution of it is there in the room. I think the capacity to integrate is there.
Do you do some sort of yourself, some kind of like opening the space psychically? If there are any ancestors present here or something, do you, in your mind, do you do something like that, or it's just intuitively present?
I think I'm practiced in a very firm sense of boundaries. I practice psychic boundaries as well to keep my, my psyche hygiene. It's really important to keep yourself very clear. So my boundaries are actually very clear. And there's a wonderful anecdote in Nan's book on Tony Wolff, I think it is, where Tony Wolff has a client, and she is seeing this presence that is haunting her client in a sense. And she just says to the presence, enough already, enough, stop it, because you are not adding to the well-being of my client. And she says it out loud, okay? So I think there is, in our lineage of practice here, we have that capacity. We have historical references. I mean, Marie-Louise von Franz is also very clear. She says, why would, your grandmother who's appearing in the hallway be my projection, right? That doesn't make any sense, not my projection. And Marie-Louise von Franz has some wonderful anecdotes about her experiences with that. And so I think that if you sense that there is, and sometimes it's not a presence in the room, sometimes it's a presence in the psyche of your client. And so if you sense that, you acknowledge that and you hold that. And I think holding that allows for resolution.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I think.
I was thinking at the beginning of when you were talking about your relationship to the ancestors and doing what many Australians do these days of acknowledging that. I was thinking how that changes the whole epistemological space in your head, in the room. You're just paying attention differently. So maybe it's not necessary to do something so hugely different. It would be much more allowing one to think differently or multiply.
Yes. And on a personal note to that, Paul, I'd like to just share personally that I'm an adoptive mother. My children are from Ethiopia. And during the adoption, I was writing this dissertation on the Red Book. And I was so very aware that I was picking up the work, the mothering work, from a family that could no longer do it. And with that, I was very aware of the, and I don't want to say burdens, I was aware of the cultural inheritance that had been bestowed to me. And so as a result, that's been very much a part of my parenting, how I show up as a parent. And there's this cultural element to parenting. And so I think that when you become, and of course living, and I've lived in several different countries now, and I think, I've mentioned in different places how, my work in London really influenced the way I came to Jung, and the way I read Memory Streams, and the way I heard Jung's voice and what he was trying to do. And so being in different parts of the world has also made me very attuned, if you will, to what a person's bringing in the room, or when I'm talking to someone who's the I, who says, I need help, right? I'm very attuned to that. Yeah.
Of course, of course. A couple more things that have come up in chat. Stefano did remind me that the collection that Stefano edited that is actually inspiring our next season, next year, most of the authors are from that book, is Individuation and Liberty in a Globalized World, Psychosocial Perspectives. So, of course, the title is relatively abstract formal, but you can see that it includes a lot of this, right? Absolutely. So there's the potential for speaking of that in this. Here's a question that might be a little extensive from Iva Pasca. Can you please tell us some of the authors you've mentioned related to work with ancestors? Sure.
So I think Abraham and Torok's work is really good. I think it's called The Shell and the Kernel. I think Anselin Schutzenberger, The Ancestor Syndrome is wonderful work. Okay. She's done data gathering on this type of lineage. When you do a family tree, what's missing? Where are the secrets? Yes. Where are the words that shouldn't be spoken in the family? Where's that uncle that disappeared? And this is also constellation work, mind you. If any of you know about constellation work, where you bring in the family tree in a kind of psychodynamic way, and that you look for the empty spaces in that process. Just to briefly share with you, I did some constellation work a few years ago, and instead of my constellation being about people, my constellation was about parts of the world that I felt were missing in my psyche, or parts of the world that were harmonious and some that were aggravating. And what's interesting is that my grandparents come from Russia and Poland and Ukraine, and that work I did was before the conflict started. And I have to say that I think I've been better able to manage myself suffering this conflict in Europe because of that constellation work that I cleared. So yes, constellation work would be another great place. I did write down a couple. Oh, of course, Sam Kimball's on cultural inheritance. Yes. Really a wonderful work. And Fanny Brewster's work on archetypal grief, where she talks about the African-American experience. She's just really fantastic. So yeah, those are some that would really get you started. And Dennis, significance of smell.
Dennis has more of a comment.
Yeah.
As so often, Dennis. Let me see. With reference to the significance of smell in the Indian film, Professor Hausler at the University of Wisconsin Limnology Lab told me how he discovered how salmon find their way back to the stream they were hatched in. Hausler was walking in the woods one day and smelled something that immediately took him back to his childhood. He cut the nerves in the salmon for smell. I think, and they could not find their way back to the home stream. We seldom dream of smell. It's an unusual sense in that the nerves come directly out of the brain and it's deeply wired. Hillman, I think, said that the dead orient by smell. Also, how the smells of Christmas trees and Thanksgiving dinners connect us to our ancestors. Coming back to the Midwest, I became very conscious that smell is a significant aspect of the Midwest experience and connection to the land of the ancestors. So you can see how that works. That very smell is, of course, so imminent. Everyone comments on that. It's so we're
I think
sensing the
Renos,
exact thing itself, right?
Right. And I think Renos, in his wonderful book on refugees and home, that this is one of the most powerful aspects to the immigrant experience. I also, let me just direct you to the scholarship of Fred Plout, who's no longer with us, but he did a wonderful article about the sense of smell and psychoanalysis. It was in IAJS a few years ago, PLAUT.
It may, I don't know if it'll be convenient for you later. I assume some of these books are listed in the article you're publishing, but also if there are any others, if you get a chance to put it on the IAJS list or maybe the activism list, or we can put it on the Facebook page.
Sure.
Psychosocial. If it's convenient for you, we'd love to do it. So
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so.
So thank you very much. Lovely presentation, lots of inspiring stuff, and the whole relationship to things, which I particularly love. It goes all the way back to that very simple, very clear, the difference between the way Freud and Jung handled dreams. Freud's going, what went wrong? Jung's going, where can this go? Which is wonderful.
Yes. Lovely. Thank you. That was so much fun for me, as it is for us who have lives of, teach, write, love. And so to share is really so fun. And I hope the sun wasn't too distracting.
No. I think it was only annoying for you. It's been perfectly pleasant to watch. Very lovely.
Okay, lovely. So thank you again.
Let me do in our last thing, unless Bernhard, would you like to do this? I was going to announce next year.
No, I was thank you, Stephanie.
Okay. Let me just announce next year's speakers. This will be announced with a list on all the email lists. We'll have our usual beautiful graphics for that. We'll start with John Beebe in January, Marianne Meister, Renata Daniel, Rula Maria Dib, Niccolo Fiorentino, Katrin Fleischmann, Daniela Eloret Fuchs, Monica Lucci, Stefano Carpani, and Elias Winterton. That will be our 2023. You will have to forward questions to Bernhard and Stefano, but they will be handling this then. So would anyone else like to say something before we close?
Thanks again, Paul. And I hope we see you here.
I shall definitely be around. So thank you, everyone. I hope you all have good holidays and you enjoy your winter solstice this year. See you next year. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for a beautiful talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.